All right, let's talk about the waves of emo because it's October and I made a video about emo, so I got people in my comments who want to give me a history lesson, but they get it wrong. You want to come in and talk about Sunny Day Real Estate. You want to talk to me about when emo started, but you don't know your history. So I'm going to give you the history lesson. I'm going to be the emo educator like I used to claim to be. So if you don't know your waves of emo, the problem we have is when most people say emo, 90 to 95% of people, yes, we do think of swoopy hair and eyeliner and raw emo, a MySpace era, Warped Tour and things like that. That's what we think of. It's like people in the South talking about Coke, okay, when they mean just carbonated beverage. It's like asking somebody for a Q-tip, okay, cotton swab. No, we just say Q-tip, all right? Emo, because emo in the 2000s is the most commercially successful and wildly popular. That's what people think of. But yes, there were multiple waves of emo, but it didn't start with Sunny Day Real Estate. It started in the 80s with Rites of Spring in Washington, D.C., and it was a hardcore punk movement because the bands in the 80s in D.C., the punk bands and the hardcore bands, they were very political, and Rites of Spring said it broke from that, and they were writing more emotional things. And they hated being called emo, for the record, and there were other bands of that ilk that wrote more emotional things, not just things about politics or racism. They were writing about other feelings and emotions. And they hated that term, so they did not want to see it live on. But other bands in the 90s after the grunge movement, like Sunny Day Real Estate, did pick up that ball. And this is not an exhaustive list. I'm not going to name all your favorite bands here, but Sunny Day Real Estate is like a prime example. But you had Captain Jazz and you had Mineral and you had others who sort of ran with it. And this is where we start to see that like stereotype of like the sad boy in the flannel or the sweaters with the thick rimmed glasses start to come into play. When people talk about like Weezer as potentially being emo, I don't really think Weezer was like fully into emo, but they were influenced by some of these bands in this genre, and they had that sort of aesthetic of some of the emo bands in the 90s that were going on at the same time. Now, the difficult thing is bands that came out of this and were influenced by this in the later stages, you're talking like 97, 98, 99, into the early 2000s, bands like Saves the Day, Jimmy Eat World, Dashboard Confessional, and probably others, bleed into the third wave that becomes the most popular wave. And those are the bands that influenced me, bands like even the Ataris. They become the sweater-wearing, thick-rimmed glasses, emo bands that make it okay to be that sad boy singer-songwriter with the guitar, letting the emotions out. And then that sort of influences the pop punk movement, and pop punk embraces some of that. And at the same time, in like New Jersey and Long Island, you have post-punk, post-hardcore bands experimenting a little bit with different lyrics and different songwriting styles, bands like Thursday. And that influence all comes together to have the explosion of what we now know as emo in bands like Taking Back Sunday and Brand New and Census Fail and My Chemical Romance. And I would even put the Used in there, even though they were out in Utah. They still have a sort of a similar sound. That really is a post-hardcore, post-punk, but very emotional emo sound. And that becomes the big influencer, the big driver. And then, of course, it gets messy from there. We can talk about third wave. Third wave actually becomes a melting pot because it was so commercially successful and so popular that every major label wanted their band to be part of the Warped Tour era, wanted to be part of the Hot Topic genre that was forming. And so you have bands like Never Shout Never that was mentioned who get lumped in with My Chemical Romance, even though it doesn't make sense. You have The Devil Wears Prada on the same show, technically, with The Academy Is for like a Warped Tour. It doesn't really make sense, but they all get lumped together. It's how Fall Out Boy and Paramore and Panic at the Disco are considered the same genre as Under Oath sometimes when we talk about emo. It doesn't really make sense, but it became more about the vibe, the scene, as we called it, from that like 2002 to 2009. And by 2009, I mean, there were just crazy bands. You were doing full-on like techno-y kind of sound and stuff at certain points that did not resonate with me. So I considered my scene pretty much over by 2007, 2009. I was on my way out. But the reality is the waves are still going. There was a big emo revival, and not that long ago, I discovered that there were still great bands making music that I had missed in like the 2010s, like Hot Mulligan and the Front Bottoms and a few others who had kept sort of some of that emo vibe alive, even going back to sort of more of the 90s emo sounds. And of course, once again, I know we all struggle with it, but there's a big emo wave still going on in rap music right now. There's rappers influenced by emo who are still making music inspired by emo right now. It evolves and it moves on and it continues to change. But I think when most people say emo, they're not talking about first wave. They're not talking about second wave. They're talking about third wave. And it never fails that no matter how much I try to clarify that in a video, sometimes I'll be like, hey, we're talking about third wave. Somebody rolls into my comments and says, what about Sunny Day? What about Rites of Spring? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about third wave. And everybody knows it. Everybody knows, but we still have to comment. So there's your history lesson.